Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. Our topic this time is Introduction to Human Resource Management. And as you can see here from the title, we're going to look at it in a broader scope than just in the private sector amongst the business world. We're going to look at it across all three sectors. So we would be including the public and the nonprofit sectors. Here's our learning objectives for this time. As you can see, we're going to talk about the three sectors. We're going to talk about civil service and merit systems. And then we will talk a little bit about each of the three sectors in more specific terms. The nonprofit, we'll talk about current themes in human resource management. The real current theme that we see not just in the US, but around the world, the alternative service delivery, which is really outsourcing, and we'll talk about that and the advantages and disadvantages. We'll talk about the Society for Human Resource Management, which is a nonprofit organization which is really built around the sector, the nonprofit sector itself. But it also is very much focused on the professional field of human resource managers. And so they are a great source of information, and you can get certifications there and things like that. And by the time we're done with this chapter and you reviewed the material yourself, you ought to be able to discuss current issues in the HR context. So these are the things that we want to accomplish this time. Here's our definition of HR. It's really the design of formal systems in an organization. And the reason we do that is to ensure that we get the most effective use possible of our employees' knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics to accomplish our goals. And so that gives us the acronym KSOX, and that's what KSOX stands for. It's used a lot in the human resource world. It refers to knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, like I've said. And this is what we need to pay attention to when we're dealing with our human resource, when we're hiring people, selecting them, putting them in the right jobs, giving them training. We're always looking to see what skills and abilities do they have, what use can we make of them, and where can we help them to get better. HR managers really do have a lot of very specific responsibilities. They're a very busy portion of the management world. And the things that they do are actually very important to organizational success. They do their recruitment and the selecting and the hiring of the individuals who work in the place. They do the training and the development, and so they have to do all that sort of scheduling and determination and analysis of what is needed. They handle compensation and benefits. They're concerned about retention of employees, so turnover is always a concern, and how to make sure that you're getting the very best people so that you can lessen the impact of turnover. HR is involved in employee evaluation as well as managerial evaluations, promotions, and they're really in the heart of things when you have labor management relations or any particular union ties. The HR department is going to be very much involved in that. So HR managers have a lot on their plate, depending on the size of the organization. Generally, is how much of any given one of those duties you might have to do. So let's just talk about the three sectors to get us off to a good foundation of human resource management. As you can see here, the economy is that overall encompassing universe that we live in, but it could be just the world itself. And but it's made up of these three elements: the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the public sector. When we talk about, let's just go with the private sector first, it's about profit. And so this is where we see business operating, corporations, sole proprietorships, individuals, partnerships, big businesses, small businesses of all types, but they are all driven by the profit motive. You can see also the nonprofit sector. Sometimes it's called by a variety of labels. The nonprofit and voluntary sector is a popular one today, but the nonprofit sector gets the job done. Here, it's not about profit, it's about a cause or an idea. It's about helping people. And so the major areas that we see nonprofits operating in are healthcare, education, religion, the environment, and just general causes and social well-being as far as that goes. Then we have the public sector, and what the public sector is about is the common good. And so we're talking about government here. Jobs and careers in the national level, which is the federal, state level, and also the local level, which is could be county or municipal. But all of those sorts of jobs, whether you're a knowledge worker in the city clerk's office of some small town in the Midwest, or whether you're working in the EPA for the federal government, you're in the public sector. The private sector has a certain set of values, and some of those values, the major ones, are shared by the nonprofit sector, but we find differences between those two sectors and the public sector when it comes to some values. Certainly what drives an organization in the profit sector is not going to be the same when you're pursuing some common good or a cause or an idea like you would in a nonprofit. As you can see here, many logos from familiar companies and so forth that operate in the for-profit mode. What we really want to know is what do they have in common, these three sectors, and where do they really differ? And so we can look at values. And so the values of the private sector certainly are powerful ones. Think about efficiency, for example. What is the lowest cost way we can do something but still getting the job done, taking into account other factors like being effective? So efficiency and effectiveness really go together in the private sector. Effectiveness, of course, is not the same as efficiency. Effectiveness is whether or not you reach your goal and accomplish your mission. Are you making money? Are you surviving? Are you moving ahead and growing? That is a result of efficiency that you hope will result in that effectiveness you need to stay in business and to beat the competition. But then again, we have other values in the private sector, such as timeliness. Timeliness, in America, we have built a whole industry around timeliness, the fast food industry. And certainly our culture encourages timeliness, but timeliness in the private sector around the world is something that is valued, that you get things done when they need to be done and so forth. And then we have reliability. Reliability is the notion that you can depend on an organization, that you can depend on your system, and so forth. And so those are four core values of the private sector. In the public sector, we also have values. Most of them are similar, those core values that we just mentioned in the private sector. Efficiency and effectiveness certainly means, can we do things the most cost-effective way but still get the job done? So efficiency and effectiveness matter in the public sector. Timeliness matters in the public sector. If, say, you have to pay your bills, or you have to dispense funds, or you have to meet the requirements of some law, timeliness does matter. And so this reliability, are you going to be there next month to deliver the same sorts of goods and services that the public needs? So those are some that are shared between the public and private sectors, but there are some values that are in the public sector that you probably won't find in the private sector. For instance, accountability to public and elected officials. In a government job, depending, you may be working for a publicly appointed official, but surrounded by a cadre of other professionals like yourself, or just career people who are doing their job, and your leadership may come and go. But your accountability is to a different set of circumstances than it would be in the private sector, where you're accountable ultimately to your board and to your shareholders and stockholders and things like that. Responsiveness to the law and government authorities is certainly a value in the public sector, but we would also have to say that is somewhat shared in the private sector, because the private sector does have to respond to government regulations of certain industries and to follow the law as well. There are strict ethical standards in the public sector. Certainly there are ethical standards in the private sector. They are spelled out in different ways though in the public sector. Some of the HR laws that we're going to discuss in the course are slightly different for the public sector employees. They're held to a different standard. They get some exemptions on certain laws, and others, they are the only ones that get the benefits of a certain act or an order or a law. and so forth. And certainly a value of the public sector is conducting the public affairs with goals of fairness and equal treatment, and social equity, and impartiality. That's what we demand and expect of our public agencies, that everybody gets treated the same and that all the people that any given agency or job should serve get treated fairly. One of the ways that fairness is tried to be established and built into these systems is through civil service and merit systems. So today, public employees in particular are hired by their KSOCs, key skills, ability, and other characteristics again. And this is what the HR professional and the manager is going to be using as their tool to say, this is what we need. And so we need certain people who have these ingredients to do the job and to do it well. Well, we got our first taste of this type of fairness from the Pendleton Act in 1883. It established that federal government jobs be awarded on the basis of merit. So this is a federal law applied only in the beginning to federal employees, and that these government employees be selected through some sort of competitive exam. At the same time, the Act also established the Civil Service Commission, which you can see their logo here in the upper right. And the Civil Service Commission was really the agency that was going to enforce any of the provisions and all of the provisions of the Pendleton Act, that the Civil Service Commission and so forth. The reason this really was spurred into being was that in 1883, this followed the assassination of President James Garfield. I believe it was in some sort of railroad car, something like that. I guess that's not really important. But he was assassinated by a disgruntled job seeker who did not get the federal job that they were trying to get. And before we had merit exams and the Civil Service Commission, there was a lot of graft. And there was a lot of what we would call today the good old boy network, that to get a job, it was who you knew and who you could pay off to get a really good government position. And this one disgruntled worker was so upset that he had been turned down and not gotten the job that he wanted, that he went and assassinated the president. So some of the provisions of the Pendleton Act of 1883 was that it was unlawful to fire or demote for a political reason any employee who was covered by the law. And the law further forbid that you couldn't require employees to give some sort of political service or contribution as a matter of keeping their job or getting a job. But when this act went into effect in 1883, only about 10% of government employees were covered, which is about 30,000 people or so. So it was a small step, and it was expanded over time, certainly, where it covers pretty much all federal employees. Today, 90% of the 2.7 million federal employees are covered by the Pendleton Act. So that means to get one of those jobs, you have to take a competitive exam, follow civil service rules and so forth, and you have a good chance at it, hopefully a fair chance like everyone else. We have another act that's really important, and it's much more contemporary, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, that needs to be mentioned here. And that's one thing you're going to discover about human resource management, is one of the things that's important for this career and being a good manager in this environment is that you need to know the law. And certainly that means the foundation all current laws are built on. So we get the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 really grew out of all the thinking that we need fairness and exams in some way to handle doling out really of federal jobs. And this act created the Office of Personnel Management. You can see the logo here on the lower right. This is a very powerful agency today, employs thousands of people. And basically, they are managing the jobs of the federal government is what they really do, to put it in a nutshell. The Merit Systems Protection Board, which had the real legal authority up here, as you can see their logo, all the way back to 1883, to safeguard the system, to oversee it, and make sure everything was always being done according to the rules. And then the Federal Labor Relations Authority, which was a particular agency established similar to the National Labor Relations Board that exists in the private sector. And it was really about monitoring employees' rights in the federal government, the rights of some of these employees to join unions and have collective bargaining in certain areas of the government jobs, not all. And these new agencies replaced the formal U.S. Civil Service Commission. So what we got was an expansion of government in a very large way, a bureaucratic expansion, honestly, but the Civil Service Commission simply was not able to handle all the various facets it took to manage the federal workforce. And that's really why we got these newer laws in these agencies at the time. The thing about the Civil Service Reform Act, that when we see how is history treated, this creation and replacement of the Civil Service Commission, it really hasn't been with great distinction. As far as most of the research and the scholars have seen, that it's been relatively ineffective. And in reality, it does seem like we've created a huge bureaucracy. We have not improved equality and fairness and access and so forth. What we have done is just created a mechanism to deal with the complexity and how large the situation is when you're dealing with the largest employer in the country, which is the federal government. Okay, state and local governments generally use the civil service model and merit systems when they hire their public employees. So they have very similar versions. Sometimes they're taken outright from the federal statutes and just copied and so forth. And so that's what you'll see if you wanted a job in the public sector in Missouri. You would contact the Department of State, which handles that sort of thing, go to the job requests and find the place where you can find the categories of jobs, the tests that are required, when you could take it, and so forth. And so it's something any average citizen ought to be able to pull off on their own. You would take a test, go on what they call a register, which is a list of people who have taken the test, would rank by their score, and there are other legislative things that have happened over time that bump people's scores up. For instance, being a veteran gives you a few extra points to add to your score. But the idea is when any given agency in a state or a federal sort of environment needs someone for a particular job, they go to the register, they interview the top people, and they pick the very best candidate based on their KSOCs. We also have the Intergovernmental Personnel Act of 1970. And this is really just an act, a piece of legislation to say the federal government ought to be able to loan its workers with expertise and specialties out to the state and to the even lower local levels for specific assignments to help them out. So these people are actually given assignments in various jobs. They're still paid by the federal government, but they're on loan, so to speak. And that's what the Intergovernmental Personnel Act does. It loans specialized employees that work for the federal government to other parts of the public sector in states and local governments. But they will go beyond that. They will also loan these personnel out to colleges and universities. They've been known to establish personnel with Indian tribal governments to help them with a project, something like that. They loan out personnel and give them temporary assignments for federally funded research projects of high import. They give them to development projects around the country, depending on what the social needs are, depending on what the public is demanding, and politics really are demanding around the country at any given time, to eligible organizations. And there is oversight and so forth. Now, local government does use the rules of civil service just like a state government would or a federal government, and they generally just copy the types of things that allow them to do a merit-based system so that they can say, yes, we are ensuring equal opportunity employment without regard to race, color, gender, religion, etc., all the language that's in the modern statutes. And we will talk about that statute. That is Title VII I'm really talking about of the Civil Rights Act. And that's one that you need to know very well as a possible future HR manager. And even if you're not in HR, you need to know about it as any kind of manager, particularly in the private sector, but in any of the sectors, it's important that you know these major laws that do govern the parameters of our behavior and what we need to do with people. And so civil service rules, they're really procedural guides to help state and local governments get it right and so forth. Here, in fact, here's one, an example. This is the Civil Service Commission in Culver City, California. And this is exactly, I pulled it from their website. Um, and as you can see, really, it's just legal language saying there are so many people on the Civil Service Commission. This is how often they meet. These are the rules that we have. And if you want to contact us, here we are. But in basic sense here, they've just copied the federal government. And this is a good thing so that it is reliable and fairly homogeneous procedure. If you want to, a public service job, this is how you go about it. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector is made up of organizations that have had to file a specific form with the government to get that nonprofit status. Now, there are plenty of organizations out there, and indeed individuals who do charitable work and do the things that nonprofits do, but they don't take that final step. They don't file any paperwork, and they therefore don't get any of the advantages tax-wise and other considerations that a nonprofit officially would get. So if you are an official nonprofit, then you filed what we call the Form 990 if you're going to be a sort of a general type of charity. But to become a nonprofit organization officially, you do have to interact with the federal government. You could go to the website, and it's the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is the one that handles this because it is a taxation issue that is the biggest thing that distinguishes an organization in the nonprofit sector from one operating, say, in the public sector. There are very specific rules. They're all spelled out in the form and so forth. Now, there are different ways to look at these nonprofits. There are different classifications. The most common one that is used is the IRS classification. And then there's also the National Taxation Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. Now, remember, a taxonomy is just a list of something. And so what we have is another way to classify them. It's a fairly long list. The IRS classification revolves around designating nonprofits with a certain numerical thing, like a 501c3 you may have heard of. Well, there are 501c1s and C2s and 3s and 4s, and the numbers go quite large, but the most common charity and the one that's out there the most is the 501c3. We'll mostly talk about that one. We'll talk a little bit about 501c4s. The rest of them are very specific. I don't think they warrant us spending a lot of time or any time really, other than knowing they exist and so forth. So there are certain rules in particular about having a nonprofit organization. And the biggest one is about how you handle your money and how you handle your taxes. Basically, your income, as long as it's related to your mission, is not taxed. And that's the biggest thing. And the other main thing is that you can't redistribute any profits as a bonus or pay raises based on your success and so forth, bringing in revenue. You can't do anything like that. So your use of money is tightly governed. You can do some of the things, in fact, all the things that business does to earn revenue. But if it's not related to your mission, then you just keep track of that money separately and you pay taxes on that. So there are some different rules of conduct. And certainly if you're an HR professional or working in the HR office in some manner, you're going to need to know these sorts of ins and outs. So with the classifications, it makes this real easy to understand. Just at a quick reference of what we're talking about. Nonprofit administrative structures, those are really just the bylaws. When you fill out that Form 990 to establish yourself as a certain type of IRS nonprofit, a 501c something, a C3 or 4 generally is what most will be. C3s being common charities, C4s being advocacy organizations like the U.S. Dairy Council or things like that. And so the IRS one is the one that we'll really talk about the most in this class. And indeed, that we interact with the most in business. Um, the thing about the nonprofit sector is just because they're doing charitable work or pursuing a cause or an idea doesn't mean they're exempt from competition. And in fact, in the nonprofit sector, competition is extremely tight between nonprofits, and also there's competition with the private sector. And so it is very complicated these days. And they also have to deal with other issues that the private sector does not have to deal with. And that in one in particular I'll name for you is the reverse cash flow. Now, when you do something in the private sector, you're focused on profit. And so you provide a good or service, something goes out, and what comes back in is some revenue. Well, in the nonprofit sector, most of the time that doesn't always happen. It's called reverse cash flow for a real reason. You put out some effort, some energy, some information, some product. You give some service, and then you don't get revenue back. And so the cash flow is completely reversed. And so you're forced into a position in the nonprofit sector quite often to be constantly trying to find sources of revenue. And that's why the discussion of keeping track of revenue earned that's related to your mission and not related to your mission is so important, because you're going to have to earn revenue wherever you can get it, but you certainly legally have to keep track of it. So you do have all sorts of challenges in the nonprofit sector economically that you do not necessarily have in the private or the public sector. Here you can see what I'm talking about with the organization of according to the IRS classification. The 501c1s are really owned by the government. And so we're really talking about things like Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac that are handling the great majority of mortgages, for instance, in real estate, homeowners have throughout the country. So we're not going to really talk about those. And C2s, I'm not sure. Those are related in some way, the same type of thing. C3s is where we'll focus our attention. This is what we expect. When most of us think of the nonprofit sector, we're thinking about organizations that work in these areas: religious, educational, just plain charitable, everything from relating to welfare of people and animals to the environment, or just whatever cause you're trying to help. And then, of course, the C4s down here are the leagues of various types that are member really focused, but they're still nonprofits in the same sense. And there are some different rules, and we'll talk about those as the course progresses. Here, the NTEE is the National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities. Another classification to look at. It is all it is. And you can see that they use the alphabet here. And here's the same really classifications that we see on really with the 501c3s. Almost all of these are C3s according to the IRS classification. Some of these others, though, public societal benefit, you could really say these are the 501c1s and 2s and so forth of the IRS. But really, anything that you have an idea for that touches human life in some way, there's probably a nonprofit that's involved in it somehow, trying to fix something or make it better for people. When you look at the country as a whole, you could see where the top 5 states for nonprofits operate, and it makes sense that it's sort of similar to what our highest states with the most population are. California's got the most nonprofits. If you look down here at the state itself, 229 point something thousands of 229 100,000 nonprofits. Here in Missouri, 53,000. Texas is second, followed by New York, Florida, and Pennsylvania, and so forth. If you look at total nonprofit universe, why is this number different than the active ones? Well, these are nonprofits that have filed. They may not be active any longer, but they haven't dissolved yet, or for whatever reason, they still exist, but there's no activity. And that's possible, and it could happen. But this is what we have in the country, just under 2 million nonprofit organizations that are active. And you can see by color code where they all go and so forth. So Missouri being a smaller population, Midwest, we're sort of in the middle as far as density of nonprofit operation here in our state. Here's some current themes to talk about in HR management, because there certainly are plenty of those. HR management, Certainly, demand for public services increases when times are tough. So an economic challenge at any given time means public services are in great demand. So if you're in the public sector and you're in HR, you're going to be really bombarded in healthcare and sectors that deal with people and give them money, say, for whatever reason it is. That's what you would be dealing with, the laws and governing that particular type of thing. But economic challenges really do mean when times are hard, public service demand goes way up. So more food stamps, things like that, more public assistance, more rent help, all of those sorts of things. Governments have to end up providing more services with less money coming in, because when people are out of work or not, buying things and paying sales taxes and property taxes and so forth, governments have to operate on smaller budgets, and it just makes it harder. Um, and we see when hard times happen, demand really does increase. We also see other trends in other industries like education. When there are hard times, we do see an increase of more people ending up going to higher education, trying to get some education to change their status in some ways, generally the reason for that. Um, and we find changes that happen when times are hard. Public employee benefits change. So if you're in the public sector and you're in HR in some manner or fashion, you're going to have to constantly pay attention to the changing rules and regulations on deductions and when they can happen. Just think about our current situation with the pandemic, how the government, the current administration wanted to stop the deduction for your Social Security for several months. Well, the downside of that was they were going to demand that money at some point, and you would take a huge chunk out of your paycheck in 3 or 4 months later, when that provision goes away. A very short-sighted sort of approach to things. Take your money. You don't have to pay any money now, but the government's going to take that money back later. So economic challenges are something that you're always going to have to deal with as an HR professional, and that means you're going to have to be paying attention to current events all the time, so you know what's going on in the country and you can respond intelligently about it. Now, alternative service delivery is really outsourcing. That's all it is. You're finding another alternative to do a certain service. And unfortunately, what we see in HR is that it becomes one of the first departments that many organizations look to outsource, to find some alternative for doing it in-house. It really has a downside though. And so I think a lot of organizations realize it is a place where they could save a little money, for instance, on payroll. Maybe it would be cheaper to have a company with expertise and a good reputation and a good response that you can work with them, do your payroll, versus having a staff full of accountants, which could be very costly for you. But some companies outsource all of your HR functions, and it really is detrimental, as we'll talk about during the course as an ongoing thing. So this alternative service delivery is also known as privatization, where all of a sudden you're in the public sector in particular. If you have privatization happening, that means, like, for instance, take the post office. There is a group of people out there that want to privatize the post office. In other words, the government doesn't own that anymore, even though it's part of the Constitution, and we want a private company to take it over and do it instead. That is privatization or alternative service delivery. You're outsourcing. It occurs in particular in the public sector, but also in the private sector. And of course, the nonprofit. A nonprofit is not necessarily going to want to have a large staff. So that may be something, if you have a small car of employees, you don't really want to have an accountant to have to do that work. So you would probably outsource it. Supporters claim that alternative service delivery provides more efficient and effective solutions. And indeed, that is true in some circumstances. But any given company really has to be careful. There are not all, let's just say that not all alternate service delivery companies are created equal. And so you have to be careful you get one that really comes through for you, that is responsive to your needs, and is someone you can work with and doesn't just pay lip service to it. When it comes to technology, this is something that is causing the world to change around us continuously. And so we have to accept that there will be constant change. And there is constant change for the HR field as well. There's always a new piece of software or something to track this or that you need to know. But using that software does help us become more efficient. It does help us find alternative working solutions that are cheaper and so forth. So a key strategic challenge for human resource managers is the ability to find the right people, because you're going to use fewer people as time goes on. There's a major trend around the world of flatter companies, which generally means fewer employees. And when you have fewer employees, this includes management as well, everybody does more work. And so when you're in this situation, you need to provide training. You have to make sure you hire people with the right CASOCs to begin with, and so forth. So you can really realize the benefits of your technology. So let's talk a little bit about the advantages and the disadvantages of this outsourcing, this alternative service delivery. Um, let's just look at the advantages first. Um, Certainly, it allows you to offload work that isn't part of your core business as an organization. So yeah, the payroll is the great example, right? It's you're not there to pay people. I mean, it's part of your agreement with people, but that's not what you're all about. You're making a good or a service, and you're doing value-added work. And so one advantage is you can get rid of that work. That's support work, and that's why it is so attractive to outsource things, because this really is support work that supports the core things that really do make your money. Doing the payroll and all the time and effort that takes does not make you any money. So it is support. So allowing you to offload that work that's not core business is really a great advantage. And therefore, it saves you money. So there's a second big advantage right there, that it saves you a lot of money. And depending what it is, um, maybe you make a product, but you don't want to go into the packaging business. So you have another company do the packaging for you. If you could find a relationship with a supplier of that service who could do it cheaper than you could do it yourself, it makes a lot of sense that you provide this sort of service, that you might engage in that relationship. On the other hand, every time you outsource some sort of service or something you need done, you lose a little bit of control. You lose a little bit of flexibility and on the spot question answering type of scenario as well. Um, but another big advantage, a third one, is you gain vast resources for that relatively small amount of money overall. And the fourth really big advantage is it allows you to focus on your strengths. So there are significant advantages, but let's take a look at the disadvantages. And that's why this is such a thorny issue and a tough issue for top management sometimes to really make these decisions. How much of our HR function do we keep in-house? How much of it do we need and do we believe in or not? On the downside, um, almost for certain, your employees do not receive adequate training and career development when you start outsourcing that sort of thing. When you do it in-house, generally it's being done by people who understand what it is that you want to accomplish. They understand the context and the subject matter much better, and so forth. So a lot of major companies, particularly like energy companies, for instance, Ameren UE here in Missouri, has built its own training facility out there at their reactor. I've been out there and I taught a course out there, and they go through all their own training rather than outsourcing various training for different types of employees. All that technical training and other training that they might need, whether it's support, knowledge worker training using computers, or if it's being out in the field, handling all that equipment and so forth, they provide that training themselves, so they keep it in-house. So it, if you don't have that access to good training and career development, it will hurt you in the marketplace. It might hurt you if you're in the public sector, not being able to provide as good a service as you need and so forth. Another disadvantage is you can't get prompt advice as an employee. You can't get quick advice. Quite often you have to call a third party, the company that you've outsourced with. And you may have to go through voicemail. You may have to leave a message. You can't always get a response right away to your email if you have an agent set up that is your liaison. And so this is a big disadvantage. It becomes frustrating for your employees when they can't get the information they need, a quick question, and so forth. And then there's something that I mentioned earlier, just alluded to, is there is a reputation out there in some industries, particularly payroll, in some of these others, for very poor service. Big reputations, go to their website, very strong, espoused values that they claim that they stand for, and yet they're just not very good companies to work with. They're not responsive. They have that voicemail that the employee of yours cannot get through. They don't respond in a timely manner, and so forth. So poor service, low flexibility of some vendors is out there, and you have to be very careful when you choose an alternate service delivery provider. Um, Not being able to do things in-house will hinder your strategic planning to a certain extent. And this is something we'll talk about as an ongoing proposition throughout the course, is the role of HR in doing that strategic planning and so forth. And it's quite often neglected, and sometimes it's the fault of the HR manager because they don't realize they should be doing it. Because they don't do it, it often results in a lot of their parts of their department being outsourced. And then a fifth disadvantage is it really has a big impact on your recruiting and selecting of people with the right KSOCs. You have to have a very good agency to work with if you choose to let an agency do this for you. Of course, you're making the final decisions, but there are companies out there that don't even make the final decision. They let an agency send them someone who's going to be hired if they pass the probationary period. So it really does have a negative impact there. And so this is something that companies really need to consider carefully, because the HR professional ought to be trained on looking for people there with the right KSOCs. You're focused on KSOCs. I will be saying that acronym so many times during the course. And the reason is, and it's important, because if you pay attention to that, you will get the right people, and you'll have the best result in your organization on what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, here is the Society for Human Resource Management. This is the nonprofit I was telling you about. And in case you weren't aware, whenever you see the domain of .org, it's a nonprofit. If you see a .com and you're clicking on something and you're trying to find out something about a nonprofit, they may be acting like a nonprofit, but if they're not a .org, and you can only get this if you file a Form 990. So this is one thing that you could know as a consumer, as a researcher, that the company you're looking at. Here's their website. Now, you can get a membership as a student. You can get a membership, and you can get certified as a HR professional. So there are careers out there in the HR field. And one thing I'll say quite honestly is the HR field is one of those things that quite often people use it as a stepping stone to hire managerial positions in some other industry, some other field. They don't go into HR thinking they're going to have a career and move up and become a VP of HR somewhere, or some people do, certainly. But for a lot of people, it is a good way. If you don't have a particular skill or a particular industry that you care about, you can literally go into HR and become a manager in any of the three sectors and so forth, and do well. So one thing about this organization here is that it is the real thing. They have a lot of resources and so forth. You can see all their topics and things. Some of the assignments I've made for the course are based on articles I've gotten from these guys. I keep my membership up with them and so forth. And like I said, you can get a discount as a student if you're interested in this sort of thing. If you are looking for a managerial job and you really don't know where to start, coming here, having membership, going through their certification process certainly wouldn't hurt you any in the employment field. I wasn't sure if I could pull that off coming back. Let's see if we can get my PowerPoint back. Okay, so that's the Society for Human Resource Management. Now, the unfortunate thing about this is here's their acronym, and it's generally pronounced SHRM. People pronounce it that way. But we also have another topic that we will talk about in the class called Strategic Human Resource Management, and it's got the same acronym. So I'll always make a distinction when I'm referring to this organization versus just the process of strategic management. Today's HR management context is complicated. There's a lot of issues and trends, particularly in the legal environment. It's the job of the HR manager to comply with all federal, state, local laws, anything to do with employment. And the amount of laws certainly are accelerating and they are changing all the time. And it is indeed taking up an increasing amount of the HR manager's time to keep up with that stuff. Of course, if different portions of the HR function are outsourced by your company, you may only have to deal with, changing laws in certain areas, but certainly you should be keeping up with all the changes that are out there. And that's one nice thing about having the SHRM to go to. You can go to their website and find out all the details on any pending legislation and what it would mean and the implications and what's going to happen and what your responsibilities would be as a result of these new changes. Social and cultural changes. Right now, there aren't really firm policies and methodologies for using social media. These always have to be developed and managed. They're going to be a little bit different for each organization. How do you handle your web page as well as your social media web page? These are not the same places. There are generational challenges of all types that really, this is a time when you can have literally 3 generations of workers side by side because people are living longer and entering the workforce longer. They all have different work-related behaviors related to their generational cohort. Millennials and Gen Z are not the same. They are different than baby boomers, who are different from the traditionalists or the senior generation and so forth. Gen Xers are in there and they are different from the baby boomers, their parents. And so you need to know those dynamics as well. When you have different things that you have to take care of in your managerial duties, some of them will come out of these generational challenges. Educational challenges are always out there, cost and access. There's a big debate going on about the worth of higher education. How does that affect you as an HR manager? Well, you certainly are looking at a world where jobs are more specialized than ever before. You need people with very specialized skills. You need people with a very minimum amount threshold of education these days to do most knowledge worker jobs at the minimum. High school education is not enough any longer. A BA is satisfactory, but certainly you need to get that master's degree if you want to move up beyond an entry-level manager in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't really matter what industry. And then there are all the current issues that affect any workplace. As an HR manager, you will deal with these sorts of human issues: violence in the workplace, bullying, all sorts of issues, problems between people, um, sexual harassment, diversity, discrimination, stereotypical thinking, and so forth. The HR manager is generally pulled in quite often, whether you want to be or not, in all personnel matters. Quite often, you do end up on the front lines when something is happening where people are being laid off or someone gets terminated. You may have to maintain a presence there and be part of that. You are certainly going to be an integral part of organizational life. Um, in general, would say that public and nonprofit organizations have to provide services much more effectively than ever before in the past because of shrinking budgets, less money. Um, we certainly can't have all these things happening here, violence and bullying, because of the legal implications. Um, so we have to be prepared and have plans in place to handle things when they happen. Um, Employees today need more professional and technical skills than ever before. So we always have to be focusing on KSOCs as a human resource manager and so forth, so we get the right people. Social media is playing a greater role than ever in all organizations, regardless of sector or industry. And so we've got to figure out what is the best practices, because we really haven't established that yet. We know some things that work and some don't, but really we're a society in flux because these things are new within the past generation, certainly, or so. And so organizations in general have to meet changing social, political, and societal needs. with a more strategic plan than ever before that includes input from the human resource management part of the company. Okay, folks, that's it for this time. I'll talk to you again soon.